morning. So we're going to be talking today about understanding our emotions as a way to understand ourselves better, specifically by knowing emotions, naming emotions, and normalizing emotions. So I wanted to start out by defining what emotional health looks like. Dr. Lindsay Gibson says that it's hard to describe what emotional health looks like in a similar way that it would be hard to describe what physical health looks like. It's actually easier to define when things are unhealthy, when they deviate from the norm. But overall, emotional health includes things like you're able to think about other people. You naturally feel an empathy for others. You're able to see their point of view. You're able to be self-reflective, asking yourself questions like, I wonder if I was wrong, or what could I have contributed to this? You have an ability to see reality for what it is. So when someone tells you, I was hurt by what you said, it doesn't mean I really don't like you at all and you're actually a horrible person. And the last marker of emotional health that I'll mention is that as a parent, you're able to be there emotionally for your child so that your child isn't alone, not just physically present, but emotionally present as well. So I want you to think of emotional maturity on a continuum. So there's no one who is completely emotionally mature in every situation. Now, most of us can improve our chances of landing, more emotionally healthy if we have a snack or get good sleep. But we often need tools to help us learn how to identify our emotions. Because if we misidentify our emotions, we can't properly process them. And if we don't properly process our emotions, then it can hinder the potential healing that we can experience in our lives. So let me give you an example that will reveal where I was on this emotional health continuum a few weeks ago. So working as a nurse in a hospital, I have to get fitted yearly for a mask, just in case I would need it. This is policy like long before COVID. So my fitting was scheduled for a 15-minute block on a day that I was not working. I drove around for 10 minutes looking for a parking space and finally found a parking spot at the time that my appointment was supposed to start. So by the time I walked in, I was 5 minutes late. But the fitting takes 5 minutes. So technically, I still had a 5-minute window. So the mask fitting man refused to fit me because I was late. And I had to reschedule and come back the next day on another day off that I had. So initially, the emotions that I felt were anger and irritation. I did remain professional while I was at work, but I was only a few minutes late. I did call them to tell them I was going to be late, which I thought was very nice of me. I felt annoyed, like there had been a true injustice. This fitting was completely doable in the time frame allotted. It also may have been a time of the month where my emotions felt hormonally heightened. But as I reflected further upon the facts of the situation and where my emotions landed, they honestly weren't matching up. And I realized that there were some emotions in me that were deeper than these initial feelings that I identified. Emotions like embarrassment, not because I was late to this one appointment, but because I am late to pretty much anywhere I'm going. And that causes problems for my kids. It causes problems for my husband. It causes problems for basically anyone or anything I commit to. And I can't seem to fix this about myself yet. And that's really disappointing, and it's really discouraging. And despite my consistent lateness, the majority of people that my lateness affects are ultimately won over by the other more positive characteristics of my personality. And this mask-fitting guy was not. And I felt inadequate, and I felt insecure. But my view of that experience changed from blame for what someone else had done to realizing what I brought to the table. So I want you to extend compassion toward yourself today. Sometimes we misidentify our feelings. We stuff, minimize, or deny our feelings. We try to manufacture what we think we should feel, believing that our emotions are not acceptable in their raw form. Because many of us weren't taught healthy ways to understand our emotions. Because most of our parents weren't taught the importance of emotional health themselves, because they also weren't taught this. Which means that in a lot of ways, we are the most emotionally aware generation to become parents yet. And in that way, we're a really pivotal generation where we are aware of and we value emotional health. But many of us are still learning what it looks like to be emotionally healthy. We're learning what it looks like to both think and feel. I was reading the story of creation in Genesis 1 last week, and it stood out to me that as God is creating the seed-bearing plants and the fruit-bearing trees, it says he created them according to their kind. And this phrase is repeated regarding the creatures that live in the water, the creatures that crawl on the earth, the livestock, the wildlife. In verses 9 through 25 of chapter 1, those 16 verses repeat the phrase according to their kind 10 times regarding creation. And then we get to verse 26, and God says, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." Not only is this a beautiful picture of the Trinity in our image, but we're not created according to their kind like the rest of creation. Humanity is created in the image of God, and our emotions are given to us from God. They reflect who God is because God feels. And God doesn't label our emotions as good or bad, except for one. Sissy Goff, a counselor and author, said in her book, The Worry-Free Parent, "Nowhere in Scripture does Jesus tell us any emotion not to feel besides fear. Not anger, not sadness, not disappointment, not frustration, just fear." So if feeling our emotions is not the problem, then why are emotions so hard to sort through? We fight against truly feeling our emotions for what they are. We try to control or conceal our emotions, a lot of times because we weren't taught to do anything other than that. But not surprisingly, as we struggle to know and name our own emotions, we also struggle to help our kids do this too. But this is something we can grow in. And there's several different ways to practice knowing and naming our emotions in our homes. When my kids were little, we kept these faces at the table. They actually have some leftover food from multiple years ago, which is wonderful. But we would pass them around at dinner, and each person would share something from their day that made them sad, mad, glad, or funny, which doesn't rhyme, but I've always really appreciated laughter. And now we go around and we share a high-low buffalo. Buffalo is just like something unexpected or funny from the day that just helps us normalize that everybody has good and bad parts of their day, and that's okay. You can use an emotions chart like this one from Raising Boys and Girls. This one uses faces to help identify emotions, which is really great for kids who can't read. And when your child is upset, or maybe before bed, or before nap time, or in the morning, you could ask them to point to a face that they're feeling, which can give words to some of those deeper feelings inside. You can also use an emotions wheel. I don't actually remember where this one came from. I honestly found it on the floor at my house, and it looks like a pretty good one. My daughter looked at it the other day when she wasn't wanting to go to her soccer game, and she couldn't quite name why she didn't want to go. And so she pointed to words on here like nervous and undervalued, afraid that she was going to make a mistake and disappoint her coach. Yet naming and knowing those feelings gave us the opportunity to validate her that her worth doesn't come from her soccer performance. And it gave her the confidence to go and play the game. Jenny Allen also offers an emotions wheel from her book, Untangling Your Emotions. And this one is free if you put in your email. There's also an app called How We Feel. And it prompts you once or twice a day, depending on what you pick, and you check in, which can help you identify your own emotions. I was told that this can sync with your Apple Health data if you want to see like how exercise or your sleep affects your emotions. I've been giving this app a try, and usually I'm in the green or the blue because low energy is where I live. But as I was preparing for this teaching, the words that I resonated with the most were actually red, which were uneasy, the vague sense that something is wrong, and tense, unable to relax, which are both high energy feelings. But I've just felt such a weight with this teaching specifically because I think our emotional health is tied so closely with our spiritual health, and I want to communicate that clearly. Understanding my own emotions and helping my kids understand theirs has been such an important part of my own motherhood journey, and I hope to empower you in your journey today. There's another app that I don't have a picture of called the Colors Mental Health Tracker that Carrie Carter has tried, and that works in a little bit different way, but it's a similar idea to this app. Also, if you have a child that struggles with talking out loud about their emotions, but could potentially write about them, you may try a parent-child journal that gives them prompts. You pass it back and forth with like no expectations for how quickly you have to reply. This one says it's between a mother and daughter. They also have some between a mother and a son. And there's some free space, but there's also prompts that just say, what are you feeling about this? Or things like that you can write back and forth to each other, that some of your kids that have a hard time talking, it might get them communicating with you in just a little bit of an easier way for them. But regardless of what emotions we are or are not feeling, we don't have to censor ourselves before our Creator, who knows our heart better than we do, who knows all our raw emotions that even we can feel uncomfortable with. In Psalm 62:8, David says, "Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." And I love this reminder that we serve a God that we can trust at all times. Not just because he is God and all those omnis that we've been talking about this semester, but because he is trustworthy and dependable as a refuge for us. Therefore, we can fully pour out our heart to him. When we allow ourselves to authentically feel, we create a pattern of processing our own emotions in a healthier way, which grows our capacity of walking through those emotions with others. And we see Jesus do this in Scripture when Lazarus was sick. And Jesus initially wasn't there. And by the time he did come, Lazarus had died. And Mary and Martha were sad and confused. But Jesus didn't scoff at their sorrow and question why the women didn't trust him more. Nor did he jump right to fixing the problem, even though he knew what the ultimate outcome would be. Instead, he sat with them in their grief. He normalized their sadness, and he wept alongside them, saying with his actions, "This is sad, and I feel sad too." So if Jesus, who is perfect, is comfortable feeling sadness and crying, why do we feel the need to say, "I'm sorry," when we start to cry? As we learn to know and name emotions, I would like to remind us that it is the parent's job to meet the needs of the child, not the child's job to meet the needs of the parent. So if we're finding ourselves embarrassed about a child's outburst in Target, and we feel insecure about what others think about us, it is our job to manage our own insecurity and embarrassment. We can remind ourselves of the truth that other people aren't seeing the whole picture. And your child's behavior cannot be where your own worth comes from. Knowing and naming our own emotions can help us separate those from the emotions of our child and give us the ability to lean in and meet our child's needs in their overwhelming feelings. Dr. Becky Kennedy, who is on social media and podcasts, she talks about sitting on the bench next to our kids and essentially saying to them, this feeling that feels overwhelming to you doesn't feel overwhelming to me. Because our kids are usually saying, I can't tolerate this feeling if I'm alone, but I can tolerate it if you sit with me. Sitting with our kids normalizes their emotions. And we can sit with our kids in their sadness. If your child comes home from school and is like, I just wish I was better at math, we don't have to respond with, you're great at math, or who told you weren't good at math? Or even, but you're so good at so many other things. Our kids often aren't looking for a counter argument. They're looking for us to sit with them in their disappointment and their embarrassment and their discouragement. We don't have to fix their emotions. We can say, tell me more about that, and then sit with them on the bench. We can also sit with our kids in their fear. A couple weeks ago, my youngest, Eliza, had a fever for several days, and before bed, she checked her temperature, and it was 100.6. And she got out of bed a little later, really scared, because she thought her fever was 106. And she didn't need me to say, 100.6 isn't scary. She also didn't need me to say, God tells us not to fear, because that doesn't work. I did draw a number line to show the difference between 100.6 and 106, because decimals can be hard. And then I held her and said, you don't have to be afraid, but I understand why that would feel scary. We also don't have to take our kids' emotions personally. My oldest started driving a few weeks ago, and she has been fairly upset about the car we've provided for her, which happens to be the car I've been driving for 5 years, but whatever. But I don't have to feel insecure about that. She doesn't need a lecture on gratefulness. I'm pretty sure Keri at that age was not super grateful for the 86 Buick Park Avenue that my parents got for me, And I definitely remember complaining about the gas gauge that didn't work, which was problematic on more than one occasion. And Emma also didn't need a lecture on how much other people don't have and how grateful she needs to be that she has a car to drive. She needed some time to sit in her disappointment that her first car isn't her dream car. And that's okay. Emotionally immature people tend to be reactive, egocentric, and insensitive to other people. But as we grow in knowing and naming our own emotions and processing them in healthy ways, we develop a stronger sense of ourself, of knowing who we are, of who God has created us to be, which actually allows us to see other people more clearly. Romans 12:15 says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep." This is very difficult to do if we are not emotionally healthy. And sometimes we get this backwards, don't we? We end up weeping when others rejoice because we're consumed by disappointment in our own circumstances. Sometimes we even rejoice when others weep. It briefly makes things feel a little bit more fair. But rejoicing with those who rejoice, that takes a posture of humility and a trust that God cares for us and knows what he's doing in our own lives. And weeping with those who weep, it's so much easier to detach when others weep, wanting to distance ourselves so we feel less vulnerable. But that's not what Jesus does. He leans in. As a mom, there are so many things around us to respond to, and it's easy to push aside our own feelings. There have been times that I'm just not the mom I thought I would be. And it's my responsibility in those moments to acknowledge the emotions I'm feeling, the insecurity, the disappointment, the shame. That means sitting in my own discomfort long enough to do the hard work of figuring out my emotions. Because parenting from an emotionally healthy space is a gift to our children. And I want to stop here and talk specifically about anger, because I think it's an often misunderstood emotion. Honestly, I struggled with anger before I became a mom, but motherhood didn't exactly make my anger problem less of a problem. John 2:13 through 17 tells us that Jesus himself was angry and flipped over tables in the temple. And if Jesus felt anger, then anger itself can't be sin. Ephesians 4:26a says, "Be angry and do not sin." This doesn't say don't be angry. It says not to sin in your anger, which means it must be possible to be angry and not sin. And then James 1:19 says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." There's many verses like this one in James about not being quick-tempered. And again, James isn't saying avoid anger, he's saying be slow to anger. Because at its best, anger is a passionate protector and defender of good. Several years ago, as I was talking about my anger with the woman who mentors me, she encouraged me to keep an anger journal for a week. I was to write down the things that made me angry throughout the day and score these on the intensity of the anger I felt on a scale of 1 to 5. And what I learned from that documentation is that my anger was rarely below a 2 out of 5 intensity. And idling it halfway to completely losing it isn't exactly slow to anger. So we studied together a chapter on anger in a book called Glittering Vices. And I want to highlight 6 things from that chapter that were key in me understanding why anger wasn't working for me. The first one is that anger is not inherently bad. Although it becomes disordered when it attacks the wrong target or it gets out of control. Anger is a response to injustice. It requires recognition that someone has been wronged, followed by a subsequent desire to get things right. Anger must be fighting for a good cause, and it must be fighting well. The fourth thing is the fittingness of anger's expression is measured by whether it effectively furthers the goal of justice or whether it merely destroys everything in its path, including the good it was originally fighting for. Even if we have a legitimate grievance, we can deal with it in destructive and disastrous ways. We can get angry too easily, which looks like irritability. We can get angrier than we should, anger that's disproportionate to the offense. We can be angry for too long, which is when resentment and bitterness sets in. And here's the last thing I want to highlight from that chapter. Anger, when it is a holy emotion, has justice as its object and love at its root. Both love and justice are focused on the good of others. Anger in these cases adds energy and passion to the execution of justice. The love that underlies it, however, keeps it in check. For love does not seek to destroy the other, but to set things right. We must show that we remember we are stewards under a God who remains in providential control. And when we take for ourselves the responsibility for making everything right and rely on our own power and plan for justice, our anger becomes excessive and aroused too quickly and too easily. So what I understand now is that anger is often a secondary emotion. It takes very little reflection and vulnerability for me to be angry. But if I look deeper, I see that when I express myself in anger, I'm more likely feeling misunderstood or feeling like things are out of control. I'm asking questions like, am I valuable? Are you willing to accept me as I am? Are things going to be okay? I'm usually angry because I'm scared. And if I only identify my anger and not the emotions that are under it, it helps no one, and I destroy whatever is in my path. So I encourage you to take some time this week to reflect on your own emotions. Take time to know and name them, and make space to normalize emotions in your house. What we feel is not the problem, but what we do with those feelings can be. And you guys are going to look more at that next week. But I want to close by giving you some resources. Like I mentioned earlier, my emotions have felt kind of overwhelmed trying to bring clarity to this topic of emotional health. And so my goal in giving you these resources isn't just to pass this overwhelming feeling on to you, but just to give you a few tools that might benefit you in various areas of your emotional health journey. So I divided the resources into 3 areas of emotional health. The first one is about knowing and naming your own emotions. I recommend Jenny Allen's book, Untangle Your Emotions. If you prefer podcasts, Made for This is her podcast, and she has a whole series entitled UYE, for Untangle Your Emotions, that walks through the ideas of this book. Every single one of these resources that I'm mentioning today is also available on Libby, which is free through the library app, and the last one's even free on Audible, because I like to read with my ears. So this one helps you just sort through your own emotions. The next resource is if you want to learn more about parenting your kids, to know and name their emotions. So these are all things from Raising Boys and Girls. There's a book on your left, The Worry-Free Parent. That is by Sissy Goff, and that is more about parenting from an emotionally healthy space. The book by Sissy Goff and David Thomas, the Are My Kids on Track, that one is more how to help parent your kids to be in a healthy emotional space. And it talks specifically about developmental stages and what accurate expectations can be during those. And then they also have a podcast, which they have an Are My Kids on Track series on their podcast that's phenomenal. And then the last area that I would like to recommend is actually if you would like to learn more about dealing with your parents who did not learn to know and name their emotions. And I recommend this book called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. I'm sure I've heard her on podcasts. I don't actually know if she has her own podcast. But this is really helpful if you've recognized that maybe you have emotionally outgrown your own parents and are struggling with the dynamics of that. Your emotional capacity affects your current relationship with your children, but it also affects your future relationship with your adult children. Growing in your emotional health won't make you a perfect parent, but it can create the space in your family to care for each other and repair the relationships when you do make mistakes. And that actually makes all of us feel more known and more loved. Let me pray for us today. God, thank you for being a God who feels. Thank you for filling your scriptures with emotions and for being a refuge for us when we don't even understand what we're feeling. I pray that you would open our eyes this week to be able to acknowledge what we're feeling and identify that, and to not be afraid to step into our own emotions and the emotions of our kids, the emotions of our spouse. But ultimately, Lord, I pray that we would turn to you. In your name I pray, amen.